Welcome to A Case of the Mondays, a podcast by 3R Strategy where we talk about some of the most pressing issues facing HR professionals and business leaders. From fair treatment of employees to fostering transparency in the workplace, we'll explore how to create an environment where people don't just have to come to work, but want to. So, if you're feeling blue, tune in and join the conversation so you don't end up with a case of the Mondays.
Welcome to another episode of A Case of the Mondays, a podcast by 3R Strategy, where we help our clients reward, recognize, and retain their people through pay transparency. My name is Ramiz Kaleem, your podcast host, and today we're discussing a critical HR process, succession planning. Many of us will have seen the show Succession, and based on that, we might think that succession planning is a bunch of entitled men and women backstabbing each other in an attempt to reach the top of the organization. But succession planning is really about identifying and growing talent to fill leadership and critical roles. And today we're discussing why HR should make succession planning a critical part of their strategic objectives and how do we do this well. And providing his expertise and insights in this month's episode is Mustafa Jaffer, who is the head of HR at Standard Chartered Bank. I asked Mustafa to send me his bio, and he sent me a David Brent meme, which said, I am a friend first, a boss second, and probably entertainer third. We will get a proper bio from him. The first bit is true because Mustafa is a friend and I've known him for 25 years, but he's the managing director and global head of HR for consumer, private, and business banking at Standard Chartered Bank. And he's also their global head of talent. And Standard Chartered is a massive organization with 90,000 employees globally. So this is a massive role. So we're really lucky to have Mustafa with us today. Welcome to the podcast, Mustafa.
Thanks, Ramiz. Great to see you again.
Yes, and you. I'm really looking forward to this discussion and finding out more about succession planning. But I've just given out your long job title. But why don't you tell us what you really do when you're not being a friend and an entertainer?
Yeah, thanks, Ramiz. Well, I'm not the head of HR at Standard Chartered. That's my boss. But I do two jobs, as you mentioned. One of them, the talent role, is to make sure that each of our 90,000 colleagues here at the bank feels that they get a great employee experience as they develop their career at the bank, and also making sure that our best and brightest are getting into the most critical and important work that we have here at the bank as well. That's a talent role. And then the other side of it is that I'm head of HR for about half of our client business side. So the consumer side is kind of covering retail, private, and small and medium enterprises, which we call business banking. That's about 25,000 of our colleagues. So that's what I do.
A lot of people who might be listening to this, and also who we speak to, they're doing things like their CIPD qualifications to grow their HR career. So can you first tell us a bit about how you got into HR? For those listening, we actually went to university together and we didn't study HR. I did economics. So how did you end up in HR? Was it a conscious choice, or is it one of those things where a lot of people, I think, they end up in a particular career?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. People ask me often. I kind of fell into it, I must admit. But the idea of when I say falling into it doesn't mean it's an accident. I think that the work I did in the first few years of my career allowed me to do a lot of experimentation. So through being on an analyst program where I started my career at JP Morgan, and then I also worked as a consultant at IBM, various different companies that I covered. I got to do a lot of different things. And when you get to do a lot of different things early on in your career, which I always encourage people to do, then you very quickly get a sense of what your strengths are, what your passion is, And therefore, at the time that the first HR opportunity came along, it began to really resonate with the kind of work that I wanted to do. And once I got into my first HR role, I must say I never looked back again. And I've had opportunities since to go back outside of HR, but I'm in HR here for good.
That's good to hear. I think a lot of people tend to have that sort of route where you are trying different things. Um, I don't think I really knew HR was such a big function when I was even in university. So it's not a career path that we really learn about. You just think of HR as the enforcers of policies and admin and not realizing the real strategic aspect of HR. So with that in mind, how I know I gave a very brief description of succession planning, but could you explain to us a bit more about, what exactly is succession planning and why is it, or why should it be such a critical part of an HR process?
Just before I do that, you said something very poignant about HR, and I think that I can't let the moment pass in a bid to kind of address that aspect of what you talked about in terms of what HR is, what versus what the perception can be. I mean, we are a million miles away from that kind of HR as an admin function at complex organizations where people are our most important asset. And even in the kind of 16 or 17 years since I've been fully in HR, I've seen that landscape evolve considerably. When I started in HR was already a strategic and important function, but predominantly what we did was we supported the business to deliver their agenda. The business, and there'll be multiple businesses in any organization, and each one of them sets out, these are the 5 most important things that we want to do, and you kind of take away a list of, okay, well, I need to make sure that we hire this many people and we develop this many people, and you kind of take it from there. Since then, actually, I would say that the role has evolved to be threefold. One, that aspect of taking the business agenda and transforming it into a people agenda is still absolutely critical. But alongside that, there's also kind of this idea about HR having its own voice to represent the fast changing landscape. So much has changed in the world of work, right? So much was changing already, I think, prior to COVID. And of course, the pandemic accelerated that. But there are times when you're leading the people agenda for the business and helping them to engage with aspects of what will happen in the future. And they may not want that at this time, but you know that they need it. And that's a tension that you kind of bring to the table and help them to manage. We've seen that, of course, as an example with hybrid working, right? It's a classic example of it. I think the shift to skills-based organizations is another great example of a dialogue that HR is having and kind of bringing to the business. And then the third aspect actually is this kind of evolving lens around employee advocacy and the increasing role that employees as a unit play in kind of determining their own path and outlining what they want. And so HR kind of represents the business, it represents the people, and it also represents a voice on behalf of the organization in terms of what's coming next. So it's a fascinating place to be, and I certainly encourage young people who are listening or anyone who wants to make a mid-career switch as well. It's a great place to be, and certainly one that the best and brightest should consider. You did ask another question though, about succession planning as something that we wanted to focus on specifically in this aspect of the conversation. Look, I mean, succession planning has been around forever. So it's not I think everyone knows it's kind of there. You just don't actively talk about it. I was actually watching over Christmas. I rewatched Gladiator. I can't remember. It might have been one of the movies that you and I watched together at university back in the day, right?
Yeah,
But I was
it
watching
was.
Gladiator, and there's a scene where Marcus Aurelius tells his son Commodus, breaks the bad news to him to say he's not going to be the successor, and Commodus is heartbroken, and but he knows in his heart that it wasn't going to happen because his father had listed these four virtues: wisdom, justice, temperance,
Fortitude,
fortitude.
temperance. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. Well,
yeah,
not the kind of criteria that immediately kind of jump out at people today, but there was a system, right? There was a system on how to take the empire to the next level. So it's really about future proofing your organization, and making sure that your highest potential employees are going to be prepared in a systematic way as the future leaders of the company. And so yeah, when I watched that, I kind of thought about, you mentioned Succession as well as the TV show earlier. I think the examples that we normally see in TV and film are all about how not to do these things rather than how to do them. But
yeah.
uh, always interesting.
Well, so again, going back to Gladiator, and you're talking about those four things that were listed uh, by Marcus Aurelius, and that's the criteria. So that's what he's saying is my criteria for a good successor. So are you saying that in an organization, similarly, you should be listing your criteria to say, for example, these are our organizational values, or these are the attributes we look for in a good leader or for these critical roles? And succession planning should include identifying people in our organization that, meet that criteria.
Exactly. Very well said, Ramiz. So we do it looking at two aspects, and we've changed over the years. I mean, you will know, of course, Nine Box has been popular for a long time, looking at performance on one axis and potential on the other. We've increasingly shifted the dialogue away from using past performance as a measure of future potential. I think studies in general suggest that it's not the best measure to use, and of course the pace at which we're evolving, the pace at which skills are changing for the future, also suggests that that's the way to go. So we still use two axes. We use skills and we use aspiration, and we have a set of skills. We also have four. So for us, we use four skills which we believe are a good measure of future potential. We look at someone's ability to grow, to lead, to collaborate, and to execute. So grow is the ability of someone to continually evolve. Do they take feedback well? Do they learn from their mistakes? Are they investing in their development on an ongoing basis? Lead, fairly obvious. Do they energize, motivate, coach those around them? Then we have collaborate, working effectively as part of a diverse team, and then ultimately execute. Can they get stuff done? Right. So those are the four skills that we use. And I don't know what else have you seen out there, because there are obviously various measures. Then I can talk about aspiration as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, I still, I think it's very different in such a large organization that you work in with 90,000 people, and a lot of SMEs, for example, that we're working with, where I think there's a different level of maturity, and the robust processes that you have, I think, don't always exist. So you might have the 9 grid process in some of those organizations. Sometimes it is a simple case of using discretion and judgment to apply to think about future potential rather than having your 4 criteria? Because I guess in your case, when you talk about grow, lead, collaborate, execute, do you have a questionnaire or a criteria that you use to measure those, or is it just saying to your leaders, here are these 4 categories, can you judge this for each person?
Yeah, we do. We have quite a bit of kind of collateral behind that, and we run a lot of people leader sessions. As you said, 90,000 people, right? 15,000 people leaders whom we're asking to assess the potential of their team across 50 odd countries, different levels of experience. So we certainly have to be quite clear about guiding them in terms of what we see as the examples of such skills being demonstrated. When we get to succession planning, of course, we do succession planning much further up at the top of the house. So there's probably more support, I think, at that point. So you get more support from kind of senior HR specialists to have those discussions. You often do those collectively as well as teams, so that you get into calibration of those discussions, and it's not a one person decision. And those debates are really healthy. They're really rigorous. People come up with good challenges around the value of a particular skill or the way that somebody's defining it. Some of it will always be an art, and I think we're quite comfortable with that. So, but we do set out those guidelines, and we do share them as much as we can.
So you talked about skills and aspiration. So skills is grow, lead, collaborate, execute. How do you measure aspiration? Because on the surface, that sounds like quite a subjective, thing. And you could even say some people, do they even know themselves what their aspiration is? And so it must be quite a difficult thing to measure.
I agree. It's difficult and it's complicated. I think this is the most difficult part of it. We do encourage here, I say more than encourage, actually, we ask people leaders to have conversations with their team members before submitting this, particularly for aspiration. We have a set of questions that we encourage all people leaders to ask in order to get a sense of the aspiration of their team member. But the complexity actually arises beyond that. And you talked earlier about organizational values and things like that, right? Because at a very simple level, I think people can confuse aspiration and ambition, right? So to some extent, you take aspiration and you simply say, well, how much desire do you have to go above and beyond to develop yourself, right? And I think we have to be careful here, because whilst aspiration and ambition are linked, there is a difference, right? So both are about future attainment, both are about being driven towards success. But the difference comes in this nuanced aspect of self-interest. Because ambition has always historically had kind of these undertones of power and rank and winning at all costs. In fact, going back again to Commodus, when he says to his father, he says, "Father, I do have other traits," and one of the ones he mentioned is, "I have ambition," but ambition was always kind of perceived to be one where you have to be careful. One of the plays that I read at school, Julius Caesar, and I always remembered that when Brutus had to explain why he rebelled against Caesar and ultimately killed him, he said that because he was ambitious, I slew him, right? And what it means is that Caesar's self-interest in progressing had gone above the interest of the people. And so we all see people in our organizations today where we think, wow, that's a very ambitious individual. Are they pursuing their own career at the cost of making the right decision for the organization. And this is where that aspect of the organizational values comes in. So for me, aspiration comes from a deep sense of purpose, comes from those inner standards, and they're linked to our values. And that's our angle here. So we're a purpose-led organization. We see that as a very important part of what we do. We have our values, we call them valued behaviors, very, very clearly set out. And therefore, when we think about, does someone demonstrate the right aspiration, then we're looking for all those elements of drive and self-development, but in service of really progressing for our clients, for our colleagues, doing it in the right way. And that's the important distinction on aspiration. And it's not easy to not easy to get right. Again, when I say you've got to get thousands of people leaders to do this.
Because I guess in itself there shouldn't be anything wrong with ambition and somebody being ambitious, like you said, as long as it's not at the expense of someone else. But if you ask someone, nobody's going to say, yes, I'm ambitious and I'm willing to, sacrifice other people's successes. So, and I know you're saying it's very difficult, but how can you possibly establish that element of are people being ambitious and self-interested at the same time? Because nobody's really going to admit that, are they?
Yeah, they're not going to admit it. What we have tried to do more of, and I think this is really critical, is to extend our 360 feedback approach. We've had feedback, and feedback's been around for a long time, right? We've tried to do as much as we can with it. We've got an app where you can give real-time feedback to colleagues, and but we've also subsequently introduced something that we call leadership feedback, which we do once a year. And at that point, leaders collect feedback from a range of from peers, from stakeholders, from their team members, from their managers, across a number of the aspects that we think are great attributes of leadership. Many of those are linked to our potential definition as well. And in that, we also give the opportunity to give as many kind of written comments as well. So you tend to get a good sense, and of course the individual rates themselves is always fascinating as well, because you can see the difference. I think that the more you do around getting a transparent culture around feedback, that really helps to bring out and call out some of these behaviors. So you've got to make it. You've got to have that clear set of values, and then you've got to get people comfortable with being able to give feedback around those values, and then you've got to have people leaders who are able to call it out and make decisions on individuals who aren't exhibiting the right set of behaviors. And that, of course, goes beyond self-interest alone, but we are quite clear that we take decisions at year end that will affect someone's compensation. We can have a conversation with that individual at year end and say, look, results alone, you would have got this much, but because of a behavioral element, we've taken off X amount. So I think it's the feedback that's the key.
So two questions. One is when you're talking about this, so obviously I'm interested from a reward perspective. You talk about the link between output and then behaviors. Do you is that based on all the data and then applying the judgment, or do you use some sort of a rating structure for this?
So we've moved away from performance ratings. And I know other organizations have as well. Again, I'd love to actually hear from you, because you see such a wide range of organizations, Rameez. We moved away from performance ratings a couple of years ago, predominantly because the ratings had become too much of a focus for the individual in the conversation. So when I say to you, Ramiz, you are a 3C, and when we had we had a number to explain the what, the results, and a letter for the how, which relates to the values on a 5-point scale. And a 3C says you're middle of the house, right? You are meeting expectations, as we call it. But you can imagine the impact on individuals. We operate in many emerging markets countries, and there's a lot of academic competitiveness as well. So many people would never had a C in their life, and if they ever got a C as a child, they would have got home and got a good telling off from their parents. So they just, the ability not to focus away from the number or the letter was really getting in the way of the real conversation. The second aspect, I think, was that once you've got a limited set of numbers or letters that you're using, actually, there's this kind of element, or even a perceived element, of force ranking that kind of starts to come through. We had moved away from that, but people still felt that there was something around that, and that every team should have that distribution. And of course, that starts to lead to competition within the team. Whereas, of course, one team can absolutely all perform in 1 year. Right? They can all deliver as a unit, and it may be another team entirely does not perform at all. So I think for those two reasons, we shifted away from direct, specific performance ratings into this continuous performance conversation approach. I mentioned earlier as well that we kind of enable this app to have real-time feedback throughout the year, and we encourage our people leaders to have that regular dialogue with their team members. And actually, what we found this year in our employee engagement survey is that one of the key barometers of psychological safety is higher when you're having a regular, transparent dialogue with your people leader. I mean, sometimes we kind of look at those and go, "Oh my God," and then you think it's completely obvious, of course, in reality. But it's great to see the link, right? It's great to see the link established. And so I think that all of these aspects of change that we're making in how we look at performance, reward, potential, I think are all additive to the employee experience, and helping all of them to be able to deliver to their best every day.
Yeah, so on the ratings, we ran a survey with around 500 organizations that participated, and there was around a 50%, 50-50 split between organizations that have ratings and those that don't have ratings. And there was a small percentage that said, I think it's between 5 to 10, that said that they were thinking of moving away from ratings. I mean, I personally don't like ratings at all, for the reasons that you mentioned as well, because the focus is all around the number. And despite what you say as an organization, it's always in the back of people's mind around that whole normal distribution, that there should be some element of that. So we actually ran a webinar a few weeks ago with one of our clients, AppCam, and they moved to a complete continuous process. And actually, they were in the Times. I can't remember if it was Times, but the one of the best companies to work for list. They were in the top 10 for 2 years in a row. So they have a great employee engagement, and they found that the switch over from the annual process, that completely ditched the annual review process, to continuous conversations. They provide guidance not just to their managers but all employees around how to have those conversations. Got rid of ratings as well. And so there definitely is a switch. And actually, I may have mentioned this to you before, but we don't call it performance management. So our approach, that we call it enabling excellence, because it's around the fact that you can't just say perform to somebody, but what you can do is create the environment, the culture, and the stronger relationships in the workplace to enable people to excel. And that really what this is about is the regular feedback. But the other thing you mentioned was the feedback process is critical. And one of the things you can sometimes find in the feedback process is it's very time consuming. And then most of the time, people are just saying nice things about other people. And it's not very specific. It's not very constructive. It's just a nice to have. And you can often even, I remember being in meetings where, the manager would read out feedback and you could actually tell who's given you that feedback. And it's just nice things. So how do you find your feedback process? Do you find that it is helpful? Do you give very specific questions for people to answer so that it is constructive? And do you find that people are giving critical feedback as well and not just positive?
Yeah, it's a great question. It goes a little bit back towards, what you said at the beginning. You said creating the right environment, right? And I love that term, enabling excellence. And I was just thinking about my kids actually. I have three little girls, and they're always up to something or other. And then when people come round, this is what parents do, right? We want them to kind of show off on our behalf, and I'll say, hey, Zoya or Shifa, why don't you come and sing that song that you were singing earlier? Essentially saying, perform now. And of course, most of the time at that moment they don't do it, because, as you said, you've not gone to
Yeah.
create an environment at that stage. You're just telling them to perform, and people don't do that. So
That's a really good example.
the feedback aspect, we found this as well. I mean, we continue to find it, right? And so we have made regular changes to that as well. We do. There's a distinction between feedback for development and feedback for evaluation purposes as well, right? To some extent, I think that when you think it's solely for evaluation, it's going to lead to your award. You've got almost a disincentive to go and get real feedback. We do allow for feedback to be given and for the decision on making it visible to your people leader to be at the discretion of that individual. So if somebody gives me challenging feedback, I actually don't have to share it with my people leader in terms of the course of what I get on a year, during the year. But hopefully it resonates with me, and hopefully I do have a great relationship with my people leader, and I can actually go discuss it with them. But it's about creating some of that safety around the process. The other couple of things we do try to role model from the top. Actually, we had our CEO did a great session with with his chief of staff, who's relatively junior to him, and she gave him live constructive feedback on a session to the whole organization, which everybody loved. And he spoke about the need to have that, and we ask all of our people leaders to kind of encourage that in their teams. So my boss Tanya, who's the head of HR, if I just send her a bunch of feedback at the end of the year and everything is hunky dory, she will not take that positively. She'll say, hey, either you're not sharing all the right feedback, or you are not allowing for an environment where people can give you constructive feedback. So that actually says something about you, right? So we're setting that bar, but even more than that, I mentioned that leadership feedback exercise, that's anonymous at the end of the year. So and when you create that anonymity, I think you get you get an extra level of honesty as well. I have found that people have used that very responsibly as well, that channel. So you've got a flip side of an anonymity, which is that people can say what they want and it's not constructive at all. But if you've got a strong sense of, as I said, purpose and values in the organization, and one of our values is doing the right thing, then putting all of that together, creating the right environment, setting the right tone from the top, giving people the right opportunities at the right times to use that feedback for development or for evaluation, all of those as they come together then allow for that feedback to get progressively more transparent and useful and constructive. But look, I'm not going to sit here and say that we have figured it all out. We're on a journey, and we make improvements against what we did every year, and I'm comfortable that that's that's the best sign of progress, is improving against where you were yourself last year rather than always comparing yourself to someone else.
Exactly. Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, that's what we're, um, even, personally, I don't even tend to look outside the organization to see what others are doing. It's about how did we do last year, last quarter, and trying to improve on that. One of the things that we do, because on the feedback, is we do this on a quarterly basis. So we have 3 questions that we ask, and the questions are, what is the one thing I can do better? What is the one thing I should do more of? And what is the one thing I have done well? And every quarter we do this on a one-to-one basis, so it's not anonymized. I mean, we're a small team. There's 9 of us. I get everyone to do it with me, so I get 8 things every quarter that I should be doing well and more of.
What is something that
But I
resonated with
just
you? Let me put you on the spot to share that. What's something you got that was really useful?
so there are a couple of things. One thing I had was, when there's an email, sometimes I can respond too quickly rather than really processing and thinking about, because I'm trying to do so many things at the same time. I might just skim read something and then reply to something and then realize actually I missed something in the email that I didn't address, or I misunderstood what was said in the email. And so one of my feedback was, look, just take your time. You don't need to reply straight away. Just think about things. And so that's something I found really useful. Another thing I found really useful was, if I have a question, I write those questions down. So rather than, sometimes I think I was interrupting someone with a question, thinking, oh, well, let me ask that question. But now I just write those questions down. And that doesn't mean that every feedback that I get that I'm going to agree with. I might think, actually, I don't agree with this. But, again, I'm always trying to improve in how I'm doing things. And so I like to get that feedback on a quarterly basis to see how I can, those are 2 examples that I can think of.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, incredibly helpful, isn't it? And sometimes you don't agree with something, but you realize 5 people have said it. At that point,
It's
you
true.
kind of gotta recalibrate
Yeah.
what you thought there.
Mm. So let's go back to succession planning. And this is all about developing internal talent, and having internal mobility. How do you balance that with your recruitment team? Because I'm guessing, 90,000 people, you must have a big recruitment team bringing people in all the time. How do you balance that with, if you've identified internal talent that is ready to progress, then does that always get priority over external recruitment, or is it a mixture of both?
Yeah, I work very closely with our head of resourcing, and the teams work very closely. And of course, they're not an external recruiting team, right? Their job is to
Mm,
find the best candidate. We will regularly advertise our roles internally first. I think we ideally want to get as many of our roles filled internally first, um, whilst being cognizant that there is always an emerging set of skills where you need to buy in. So I think the theme that we grapple with increasingly is this idea of kind of build, buy, and borrow. So to what extent do you build those skill sets in-house, and you kind of continue to focus on that, and get as many of your own people into those opportunities as possible, and that's internal mobility. What do you go and buy from the market? So, are there emerging themes. For example, in banking, we've had to do a lot more work in recent times around cyber. That wasn't a skill set that was ordinarily in-house. You have to go out and you have to buy that skill set in. But then increasingly you expect those leaders who come in to start developing that in-house. And then actually the other aspect of it is borrow, which is I think as we get better with tech, and we have a tool that we use called Talent Marketplace that allows for our colleagues to go on and post some work that they've got that they want done. So let's say you don't need a full-time person, you just need somebody 1 day a week, or you need 10 hours a week, and you need a particular skill. You need someone who can code for you. And then at the same time, those who might want to do a little bit more, get exposure to a different area, they can go in, and there's a bit of an AI matching process around it that allows for movement of work, right? So it's not actually just specific jobs anymore. So finding that balance of build, buy, and borrow is something that we talk about constantly in a bid to kind of optimize this overall piece around getting the right skills into the right areas for work to get done. And that's something that I talk about with the resourcing team, but also what we call our people capability team, our learning team, and we work very closely to try and balance these things with the heads of HR.
When you're looking at succession planning, and it's about having a pipeline of talent for your roles, but how do you balance that with having a pipeline in the future? So and how far in the future are you looking when you look at your succession planning process? Is it next 2 years, 5 years?
Yeah, let's do that word process. Process is never the most interesting part of any dialogue, but usually one of the more critical components. We basically have 5 steps to that process. We actually we as I mentioned, we kind of do it towards the top of the house. Having said that, we're still doing the succession plans for a couple of thousand roles here in the organization. But let's take it at the big management teams, by business, by country, and of course our own group management team. The first thing we try to do is identify what those critical roles are. What are the value roles in our organization? What are the most important roles in which we need to have our best people? And we need to ensure that if there's movement in that role, that we're ready, and that we are developing people over time. So that identification process is key. Go ahead. Yeah.
So, and how do you identify those roles? Do you have a definition of this as a critical role, or do you have a set of questions that you ask?
Yeah, so identifying value roles, I think we could do a better job of it. We link it to the objectives of the organization. So which roles disproportionately are going to impact the delivery of the key goals of the organization or the business? You can actually really get into the science of it and go very deep. You start to get into a balance of the time spent versus the how much value you gain from that. I think intuitively we're probably getting 80 to 90% of it just by having that relatively simple criteria of 5 or 6 questions that you ask yourself, and then you say, yes, I think that's a value role. And you've got to have a cutoff at some stage, right? I think a management team can manage maybe 30 or 40 roles in one go. So we figure out those roles, then we identify. We've of course identified. We've gone through that whole potential process where we talked about skills and aspiration earlier, and then we match that high potential to the roles. Of course, there's got to be a minimum technical bar as well, right? We haven't kind of spoken about that, but you take the skills and aspiration, there may be a minimum technical bar for that role in addition. And then we typically kind of have this: someone's ready now, someone's ready near term, might be 1 to 3 years, and then someone's ready kind of further out. So there are three broad time horizons that you have to consider. And then for those individuals, you have to think very differently in terms of what you're going to do for them. You've got to figure out how to manage those individuals who you believe are ready now. Maybe you've got to put them into the job. Maybe you've got to make that tough call, right? Maybe you have to find another role for them. But you can't have someone who's ready now kind of sitting there too long, is always my view. Otherwise, you tend to go past that point, or they may even leave, right? So they're your priority. Then you've really got to figure out how you're going to give those folks who are near-term ready the exposure that they need in that next 1 to 3 years. And I've seen too often, someone says, yes, this person's kind of 2 or 3 years away from being ready. And they're always 2 to 3 years away from being ready because they continue to do the same thing. So you've actively got to say, these are the three things they don't have right now. And then they've got to make quite a tough decision sometimes to move in a certain direction to develop the aspects that they need to be ready for that. Again, I think in the future, this kind of emerging borrow aspect that I talk about, where you can go and do little gigs on the side, I think will really help that, because people are often reluctant to kind of move away from a comfort zone in the core space that they have. And then you have, this kind of longer term horizon, these rising stars, where you can play with it a bit more, right? And you can put them through much broader learning, and you can even challenge yourself on whether they have multiple career paths, right? One of the aims actually ultimately is not just to fill each role, but it's to get a team that has a diverse set of skills, and a team that doesn't just work for their own role, but actually contributes beyond their role, right? So we call them enterprise-wide skills. So I think as you get further down the organization, you can restart developing individuals with these enterprise-wide skills. And actually, that's probably the most fun part and the most interesting space in which you can operate if you get it right. The last bit that I will say, and I'm sure you have plenty to comment on this, is of course there's always in all of these processes there's kind of a what did you miss, right? And as I've thought about this kind of skills, aspiration, doing the succession planning, is this kind of aspect around making sure that you've got the right diversity around the table. And does your process set you up to ensure that you're maximizing the diversity, or are you going to need a deliberate look at making that additive? And I'm sure you've seen a bit of that. Why don't you give me your views, and then we can talk about that as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the whole EDI link to this, and maintaining any sort of targets you have, for example, or identifying biases in the process. Personally, I'm not a fan of quotas at all, and I think it's good to have targets. We have targets for everything, but it's not a big deal if you do miss the targets. That's our approach. But you have to aim for something, and I think with the whole EDI, it's difficult. I mean, I think it's much more difficult in smaller organizations. It's the same thing as normal distribution. You can't aim for a normal distribution in a small team, but I think you really need to get to a place where you have that transparency and everything is happening naturally, but it's very difficult in such a large organization. And that's why you tend to see a lot of organizations have targets and a minimum quota that they're looking for. So, I mean, I know I'm not really answering your question, because I don't really have the answer to this. My view is just that I'm not a fan of quotas and targets myself.
Yeah.
When it comes to EDI.
I mean, it's a topic that always generates a lot of debate. Of course, the American universities this year, we've seen this whole theme around affirmative action. I mean, I won't cover all aspects of it because I think it's a whole topic in itself. But when I think about the succession planning process, I think at times we do have to be deliberate about ensuring that we're being sufficiently inclusive to allow for everyone to get a chance. I mean, we go back to aspiration, for example, right? And I laid out what I see as my view of aspiration, but it is difficult to measure. There's no doubt that you have certain minority groups. In fact, often any minority groups will typically, in some way, you'll find are demonstrating lesser aspiration than the majority group, right? Whether it's because you kind of sit there and you see that everybody at the top looks different to you, and you don't have quite the same hope, or whatever that reason is, that ultimately emerges as one of the aspects. I mean, there was my dad is into to history, and he's a big fan of Islamic history as well, and actually he was just last year telling me this story that he'd read about a famous jurist in Islam called Abu Hanifa, and this is a story of 1,000 years old, right? But the Caliph at the time wanted Abu Hanifa, who is known to be the most righteous and knowledgeable man, to be the chief judge. Abu Hanifa did not want to be a puppet to the Caliph, and so he told the Caliph, "Look, I'm not qualified." Right? And the Caliph said, "Don't be silly. Of course you're qualified. You're lying to me." And Abu Hanifa said, "Well, either I'm lying, which means I'm not qualified to be the judge, or I'm telling the truth, which means I'm not qualified." Right? And that's how he ruled himself out. Essentially, he was the best person for the job, but did not aspire towards that job, partly because he didn't align with his value set. But nevertheless, the broader point is that you're going to have people in your organization. Politicians, we often think of that way, right? You think somebody's right for the job, and you think, well, you're the person to do it, and they're like, "Look, I don't like politics." Right? That's why you're the right person for the job, right? So,
well, politicians don't tend to lack aspiration
or ambition, right? But that's the flip side of that conversation. So you almost have to really have a slightly different approach towards identifying and focusing on some of your minority groups, and that's where I think that sponsorship initiatives, things like that, I think are redressing the balance. I don't think that is positive discrimination. I think a natural bias exists, and you have to take some steps to address that bias and kind of bring it back towards a norm. And that's where we, might do very specific talent programs focused on certain minority groups, or, in terms of encouraging them to kind of take that next step, or, helping to create that environment in which they feel comfortable doing so. I think all those aspects are important in this process, and so that's where I think in our succession planning process as well, we have a very deliberate section around this, where we make sure that ultimately we have a look, for example, at if all of our succession plans came to fruition, what would that team look like? Would that team look like the kind of diverse team and have those diverse experiences and skill sets that we need in the organization? And that often helps you to get to the answer on what you need to do more of.
Yeah, no, I completely agree on that, and making an extra effort with certain groups to address that imbalance. It's that whole discussion around the difference between equality and equity, and if we recognize that there are imbalances or there are certain disadvantaged groups, you can treat everyone equally, but that's going to maintain the imbalance, or you try and address the imbalance so that there's equity. So I completely agree on that piece, but I guess I was talking more around, saying you need to have 20% in this group of this group and 10% of this group.
Yeah.
And that's where I think, if you address those imbalances, then over time, hopefully that should be addressed. But we don't want to force that distribution, because that is another form of discrimination.
Yeah. Oh, we're like you. We set targets. We don't have quotas. We want to be aspirational around this. We want to set direction, and we have made good progress, I think, with those targets. But there's always more to do.
So, given that we're talking about succession, let's have a question from the show Succession. And apologies to anyone who hasn't watched the show, but so this is essentially like I said at the beginning, a bunch of entitled men and women who are trying to reach the top of the organization, where Logan Roy, who's the character, is the CEO, and it's about who's going to be the successor. So my question to you is, let's say that you receive a job offer from Waystar and you join them as their head of HR, and you are now responsible for picking the successor for Logan Roy. And who would you pick?
Wow, that's a good question to end on. I have to say, by the way, it's a brilliant show. I recommend anyone who's listened in to this and hasn't seen the show, I would recommend you watch it. I often say that you always look for the examples of how to do things, but equally look for the examples of how not to do things, and both are equally helpful. I was also, Ramiz, I'm sure like you, really disappointed that they had no head of HR as a primary character in Succession, right? They had their CRO and their CFO, and I think the
PR was there.
Yeah, exactly. That's
PR
right.
was there, but there's no HR.
There were a number of functions, so I think that's probably their biggest miss in the show. But let's say I was looking at some of the main characters there. Gosh, that's a tough one, right? So who would I pick? Let's go back to skills and aspiration, right? And actually, it kind of almost brings back this aspect of why the distinction between ambition and aspiration is important, because all of them had incredible levels of ambition from a self-interest perspective. So if you kind of did that in its rawest format and said, do these individuals aspire to lead the company? Almost all of them did. Everybody wanted to be the CEO of Waystar. But did they want to do it to kind of further their own agenda? I think for the most part, yes, to further their own ego. Right. So otherwise, in the aspiration sense, it probably rules all of them out. Right. From a skills perspective, we had Kendall Roy, of course, who's seen as the favorite, and I'll do my Kendall Roy impression for you. I don't know. I mean, Kendall was kind of complicated, right? I mean, he's on drugs. He killed a man, and he's just really desperate to show his dad that he's worthy. So I don't know. So
on that basis, I know you mentioned his skills, but with that description, he's still making your shortlist.
No, he's not. In fact, we're doing spoiler alerts here. Gosh, turn off now if you don't want a spoiler alert. But of course, his sister, Shiv, and of course, we realized during the show that Shiv also means knife. It's called the Shiv, right? Yeah. She points out, Kendall, you killed a man. You can't get this job, right? I think, what did Kendall had some leadership qualities, right? So if we go back to ability to lead, I think his brother Roman had some good collaboration skills. Shiv probably had quite a few of them, and I think Logan Roy used each of them at the right time to deliver what he needed. Probably Jerry, who was the CRO. I think she was of all of the characters probably the safest bet to lead the company. But I recommend everyone watches it and makes up their own mind.
Yeah, no, I think I was thinking about this as well, and I don't think I would be able to pick. And my advice, as always, which is to, if you find yourself in that situation, is to find another head of HR job, because you're not going to change the culture of that organization on your own. Because I mean, one of the things that stuck with me about that show was, Greg, one of the characters early on, is trying to do the right thing, and talking about, this is a really toxic culture at one of the TV show, and I don't really want to work here. And then right at the end, it's he gets asked by it was Tom, I think, do you want to do a deal with the devil? And so this is the character that at the start was saying, I don't want to work in this culture, and he responds with, well, what am I going to do with the soul anyway? And so he's ready to now sell his soul. And it's, if you find yourself in that environment, it's very easy to get sucked in and become part of that culture. And so I know it's sometimes difficult, but I would say just walk away before you make that make that decision with Logan Roy.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's a very key takeaway. I mean, I think I stressed that earlier. We have a very strong sense of purpose, a very strong set of values, and that is a key measure for any organization to take. You've got to find those individuals who are going to align to doing the right thing for your clients, for your colleagues, and those are the people that you want to put at the top of the house. Sometimes at the expense of their technical capability, even, right? So that when you get to those really tough decisions and find that balance, it's those individuals who are going to inspire the future workforce.
A lot of people listening are in a standalone HR function where they might have 50 employees or 100 employees. Should succession planning be do you think, on their radar if you have an organization with 100 employees and you are the sole HR person working there, or you have 2 people working in HR? And if so, how should they go about looking at this?
Yeah, I mean, I think every organization has a set of individuals who are in the roles that are most critical to the delivery of the goals of that organization. It might be 3 or 4 or 5 people in an organization of 100, but if those individuals walk out of the door tomorrow, you need to be ready with a plan. And you've also got to make sure that those remaining 95 people, how do you make sure that you give them the inspiration and the challenge to really want to be in one of those top 5 roles at the end of it? And of course, last but not least, I expect that most organizations with 100 people today are aspiring to be an organization with maybe 1,000 people or 10,000 people someday. A lot of small places started out with 100. So look, it doesn't have to be a huge process, but you should definitely be thinking about future-proofing your business.
So thanks a lot, Mustafa, for all of your insights and knowledge. I found this really interesting because I think it's not something that you have a lot of exposure to within many HR teams, unless you work in a large organization. So I think this is going to be really interesting for a lot of people listening on how they can really start to incorporate succession planning into their HR strategy. Thanks everyone for listening, and hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we will see you next time on A Case of the Mondays.